Okay, good afternoon from Language Note. This afternoon, welcome to our session MFL SOS Behaviour Management in the Languages Classroom. Behind the scenes today is Fiona Easton, who is our Head of A-Level, and she will be recording the session for us so that anyone who has not been able to attend the session live this evening or who has to leave early. And I understand that when you've been teaching full time and maybe you had a full day of teaching, you may have to get off early to pick up your own children, or maybe to attend another meeting, or just to simply get home and enjoy your evening. Then obviously we will make sure that this link is sent out to you after the session, as well as the resources if you would like to have those. Just draw your attention to a webinar that we've got for next week. If you're teaching Arabic, how to successfully consolidate your language curriculum with Arabic B, will be on next Tuesday, the 28th of February at 12 o'clock UK time. And that session is being run by an Arabic teacher and a head of languages in one of our schools that subscribe to our Arabic product. Okay, so those of you that already know me, my name's Elaine Gelder. I've got lots of experience. I won't dwell too long on that section, but I work now as Director of Education for Language Note, having been formerly working in a large trust, working alongside lots of different colleagues in every subject that you can think of on the timetable, and more latterly in the last 4 years of my teaching, actually the last 4 years, I was Senior Director for languages. Just to draw your note to that, obviously, we get a lot of our ideas from teachers that I've worked with, but also from my other colleagues in Language Note, because there are quite a few of us now that are ex-teachers. But also to fully appreciate this, the content of this PowerPoint presentation, it's really important that you use it alongside the recording of the session. And we'd also like to thank everybody in the languages community, loads of you who are often sharing your ideas on social media. And all of the ideas in this given in this session tonight are tried and tested, but they're only suggestions and they're not mandatory, obviously. So please be mindful of the policies of your own institution, which is really so that you don't let your own school down if they are being inspected or if anybody comes to view your teaching. This session was born out of a session that I ran last November for the language show in London, which was it wasn't a face-to-face event, it was an online event. And as a result of it, a lot of the ideas that I used in that session are in tonight's session as well. So I always think about myself as being kind of in the middle, the three balls in the middle of the Newton's cradle. You need to be the constant person in the classroom all the time and not be kind of disturbed or kind of like upset by the behaviour of your students. So you almost got to try and keep that going, so that you might be being battered on both sides by all the behaviour problems that are happening in your classroom, stuff that's going on in the corridor, maybe outside your room. And obviously whilst you're around the school yourself, you sometimes have to deal with lots of different behaviour issues, whether that be on break times or lunch times, after school, before school, if you're doing a cover lesson in the dining hall, wherever. So it's trying to just imagine yourself as those three balls in the middle, really, and so that everything that's going on around you doesn't put you off doing what you're trying to do, which is give the best education to the students that you're teaching and that are in your care. So today's session is a very brief look at teacher standards, because we get overwhelmingly after every session I get teachers asking me, how does this link to the teacher standards? How can we possibly, how can I say that this is part of my portfolio if you're an ECT or your second year teacher, or you're going through UPS through the threshold and so on. We're going to have a look at the basics of what we can all sort of think about in our classroom, any issues to be aware of, and then obviously some strategies and techniques. So these are what I've taken from the links to the teacher standards. And if we look at, I think, teacher standard 4, making that effective use of lesson time, so that you're not having to waste lesson time dealing with behaviour. So that kind of links in there quite nicely for me in terms of behaviour with TS4. And also with teaching standard 6, making use of that formative assessment. I've always found, having spent a good, I would say 18, 19 years teaching in some very challenging schools in inner city Leeds, that if the students knew how they were doing in their lessons, in other words, informing them of how they're getting on, rather than just giving them that summative document at the end of the year or the end of the course or a unit of work. This is how you've done. Just keeping them informed every step of the way so that they know how they're doing enables them to work better. So the basics. I've always found that structure, because a lot of the students that I've taught that have had behaviour problems in many instances have had a lack of structure at home. All the adults they meet maybe could be quite aggressive, and they test every adult that they ever meet in the classroom. So structure has always been important for me. Clarity, so making it absolutely clear what's going on and what they're going to be doing. Being consistent with everything from what I'm teaching to how I deal with any behaviour issues. Focusing very much upon positivity and being very positive. I know that's hard to do a lot of the time when your back's against the door and you've got 30 kids in there, maybe 10 or even all of them are kicking off and they're wanting to get out of the classroom, as I've had happen to me on a number of occasions. But trying to be as positive and stay as positive as possible is key. Being flexible as well, within certain parameters, and also being quite attentive in terms of to their needs, but also to your needs, and also to the needs of how you can best fulfill the needs of a class that are in front of you. So with the structure, I've always felt that making sure that the children in your class know what is going to happen, what to expect in your lesson, making it predictable so they know what's coming. They know that you're going to be possibly covering certain skills, certain activities. They know what the type of behaviour you're expecting of them. If you have a good discipline system in your school, and if you work in a trust, you might find that you've got some amazing discipline procedures in your trust, and that does allow you to get on with your job. However, there are a lot of staff and students who are in schools and who work in schools where that's not the case. So you often have to make your own classroom run as you need it to run within maybe a school that's running not as you would want it to be. So I've always tried to get those expectations and the predictability from the beginning sorted out, with a little bit of surprise occasionally around my methodology. Knowing where the learning fits in, so giving them the bigger picture and why they're learning what they're learning helps as well, because that links to the type of structure that they possibly need, which they may not have in their lives outside of your lesson or in their own lives. Keeping activities short but purposeful and meaningful, so pace and keeping it moving in spite of something that might not have worked. I've always thought, well, I've ditched that, I'm going to move on to the next thing. I've always tried to keep my activities fairly short, fairly pacey, because that does help with short-term retention. With the short-term retention span that a lot of students who displayed issues with behaviour, they often need that sort of short-term retention span. So keeping your activities short and pacey. For example, if you say to them, open your books, write down the date, rather than trying to say, right, what we're going to do now is open our books and then I want you to write down the date. I always just kept it really short. To open your books, write down the date, if that's what you do in your school, or open your books and let's make a list of this vocab, so write this list down, or whatever you can. So I've always given them the minimum amount of instructions that are needed. That does take some thinking about, because as teachers we're used to sort of talking things through, but with students who have behaviour problems, who present these problems, keeping it short so that they don't have to worry about anything else and their mind just focuses on what you're asking them to do. Knowing the names of your students is so important. It will become clear to you, as I know. I'm not teaching any of you how to do this tonight. This is just my experiences and what I know works, but also just to sort of kind of, people often say to me after the sessions, gosh, I've not done that for years, and suddenly it's brought it back to my memory. You always end up finding that you know the names of the trouble causers first. I've always tried to look at the names of all the kids in the class before and try and pick some of the ones who are the better behaved ones, and then try and go in with their names first. The start and the finish of lessons is so important. So I've had a starter on the board, or whatever you call it, in your lesson, and we'll look at some examples later on in the session, and also an end section. So I've made sure that I've finished a few minutes early so that I can reward the students who've worked really well by putting points on the system, or however it is you deal with that in your school. Time indicators have worked really well. If I'm doing maybe 5 activities in a lesson, or 4 or even more, I've kind of put on the board, right, I expect that to be finished in 4 minutes, and I've put that on the board, made a list of activities so that the students with those kind of behaviour difficulties can sometimes think, well, I've achieved that and that, so I'm actually making some progress in the lesson. And listing the activities so that they can be ticked off is a good way of keeping them focused and out of trouble. Obviously there's some screenshots here from Language Note, which you can see how we have the different activities and different modal skills and modalities, as some people now call them, on our website. So again, just making sure that you're dealing with as many different tasks and as many different skills as you can, without making it too busy and without making it too much in a lesson. My own personal successes have always been around making sure I've had a language and objectives that's been, what are we actually learning today? So this could be linked to, we're beginning to talk about pets, we're becoming more confident with the past tense. How are we going to learn that? What kind of activities are we going to do in the lesson? And why are we learning it? So are we learning it because we've got an end project that we're having to do? Are we learning it because it's in the exam specification? Are we learning it because we're going to be doing an assessment that's linked to that? And again, I've been careful with some in the way I've looked at my lesson objectives. I've looked, well, becoming more confident. We're beginning to do this. And if you've got a student there who is having difficulties learning, you can apply it with occasional support, or you can apply it with visual support. Again, this might not fit with your school, but these are the things that I've done to help students stay on track with behaviour. And you can see some examples here from some learning journeys that I'll show you in the next couple of slides. So this is an example of a learning journey that I used with my last trust, that the teachers that I worked with, we put these together as part of our trust-wide scheme of work. And you can see here at the top, you can see where they're coming from. So the student enters this snake and they can see what they've done, what they're actually learning. They could even tick off where they've got to if they felt that's going to help them. And then they can see the next step where they're going to be going. So they can see how it fits in the bigger picture. And then at the bottom, we can see why I'm learning this. And again, that's one for Spanish. I've got lots of these, which I've been privileged to work with staff who've created these, but also many people who've sent me many since I've joined Language Note. Again, I'm happy to share any of those with you. So the basics then, as far as clarity goes, having clear expectations, making exactly clear what you expect, and keep that revisited. You could even have it on the wall. I've worked with some teachers who've ensured that their students write it down in the first page of the book every year at the start in September, and they never revisit it again. People have said to me, that's what I want to do in my lessons, and that's their choice to do that, but it's never worked for me. I've always made sure that I've had my expectations clearly visible at all times, right at the front of the lesson, so that the students know when they're actually not doing what I'm asking them to do. Having your targets, so you might have some students who on this slide I've got 5 sections at the bottom there in different colours. I might make a bookmark, or they might make a bookmark of words that I would expect to see in their work over a term. So it's just to get them into the habit of keeping the regular revisiting of certain key things that they are capable of doing. I wouldn't make them overly complicated for students who were not able to learn those kind of things. But certainly I would give them that bookmark, and they would keep it in their French, German, Spanish book, and they would then make sure that every lesson, when we did a piece of writing, they would include those aspects of what was on that bookmark in their piece of writing. This is one that I call a snaky piece of writing. So basically they just draw a snake down the piece of paper, and they would then put their writing either on the left or the right of it, and it's just keeping it what you're expecting them to do in a given time frame. That's a very clever young lady who decided to write every other line, well, every 2 or 3 lines. But do you know what? We got some work out of that lesson. I've even gone up to a child and drawn a line on their book, and I've maybe gone down a third of the page, or maybe even 5 lines, and said, I expect you to write this piece of work and fill that section there with the minimum of 40 words or something like that in a lesson. And particularly for me, it's worked with year 8 and 9 students, depending upon which years you do your options in. If you do your options in year 8 or in year 9, then it just keeps those students focused on getting some written work out of them. And then I've given them a reward after they've done it. I mentioned about having the clear instructions, open your books and write this down. That's always, I've mentioned that, so I'm not going to revisit that. Always try to look at what they might misunderstand as well. So, you know, think when you're thinking about your lesson, what is it that you're delivering in that lesson that possibly they might not get? And how are you going to deal with that in the lesson? And that helps me to sort of plan and think, right, where could the behaviour in this lesson start to go if I interpret where the misunderstandings could be? And giving an example and a clear model. I'm not a fan of these things like waggle, what a good one looks like. But it does help if you've got some idea and the students have got an idea of what you're expecting them to do. So maybe some examples on the wall, or maybe some examples that you've got laminated and you have them scattered around. It's interesting, I've seen some pupils that I've taught who've been quite tricky in the lesson, but I've said to them, go and have a look at that piece of work in the wall, on the wall over there, or go and have a look at that piece of work that's been laminated and is on that desk in the corner. And they've actually gone up and stood up. They might just need that little bit of a stand up and a little bit of a stretch in the lesson just to go and have a look at that piece of work. And you know what, they might come back and just get back on with their work. They might not. They might come back and actually smack somebody over the head and go and sit back down again. But at the end of the day, I've always found that just giving them that kind of like trust in them to get off their seat and go and have a stretch and have a look at a piece of work that's been done, that somebody else has done, that's already been on the wall or has been laminated, has helped behaviour and their attention span. So keeping things consistent then, reinforcing your inspector behaviours, just be keeping that consistent, having your consistent routines of entering. What will it look like when they enter? What is going to happen when we're inside the lesson? How is the lesson going to finish? And if things are going to change, let them know. So when you are, for example, working in a school and maybe you are going on a course, if that's ever possible nowadays with the amount of money that's not available in schools, but if you know you're going to be out on a meeting or something like that, or you're just not going to be in the lesson, then just let them know that you're going to be coming back and that you expect the work to just be as good as it was when if you were in the lesson. Obviously, if you're poorly and you're off sick, that's a different matter. But if you know that they're going to be out of the classroom for a while and it's a class that's a bit tricky, that you're a little bit worried about leaving in terms of somebody else picking them up, inside you might be partying thinking, yeah, I've got a lesson off that class. But if you can make sure that they know that you're coming back and that you're going to be expecting the same type of behaviour, it does help sometimes. Depersonalising the sanction, so sanctioning the behaviour, not the pupil. It's important to make it clear that it's the pupil that's making you give the sanction and not me, and that it's not personal. It's not you with a personal vendetta against them, which allows you to avoid that emotional involvement. But following through of sanctions and giving rewards is so important, and it's the worst thing at the end of the day when you've had a full day of teaching. You've got five or six other things to sort out at the end of the day, if not more. And it's the easiest thing in the world to forget to put something on the system, whether that be positive or some sanction that you have to give. And that's why I have always made sure that at the end of every lesson I've had something on the board for the kids to do, or I've asked them to do something, so that I've got that chance to do that before they leave the room. And then once it's done and you can move on. Positivity is something that I mentioned at the beginning, acknowledging that good behaviour, killing them with kindness. putting on that smiling face, saying to, you know, your girls coming in, oh, you're looking lovely today, or, you know, oh, that perfume's gorgeous, you know, just, oh, your hair, or some of the lads, you're looking really smart. Just getting that good behaviour and that effort and that attitude of just acknowledging that kind of, you've done really well today, or even just a quiet word with a child if you think that child doesn't like to be made a fuss of, or is embarrassed, or just doesn't like that kind of thing. Praising them all the time. Focus on what's going well and catching them behaving well, catching them in rather than catching them out. Giving them that kind of notion that it's okay to fail in safety, that it's okay to make a mistake, and it doesn't matter if you know that you've said something in the language and it's not come out quite right. Be that kind of like, it's okay to make mistakes, and that will enable your students to feel as if they don't want to kick off if something if they make a mistake. Completion of activities, as I said before, if you can get a child to do what you've asked them to do, even if it just means ticking off 3 things on the board that you've asked them to do, listing those things for those kind of students does bring a reward for me. And I've always given them house points or whatever you've got in your school, because there are so many different things out there now that you can give in terms of that. I've always avoided pointing at pupils because they find that quite intimidating. But you might have a different experience to me. One thing that I've always done is set mini deadlines with the pupils. So at the beginning of each half term or beginning of the term, I've always said, right, we're going to have something to look forward to. So whether that be a film that they're going to watch, a 15-minute section of a film, or whether it's going to be a piece of music that you're going to listen to, you might say to them, we're going to do a little assessment, a little quiz. We're going to do a little piece of extended writing, and I'm going to let you choose the music that we listen to, and that can be one of your rewards. That, you know, any students who do really well, who you feel can say, right, which are your favorite people that are singers and pop groups, and we can listen to some of the music, whether that be a breakfast or anything that you feel is you want to do with your students. Make sure they put that in their planners, and boy, will they hold you to that when it comes to that. But it's just given me something to say to students, right, 3 weeks to our whatever it is, to our French breakfast, or 4 weeks to our film, and just keep reminding of that you know, behaviour's going really well, we're getting to that deadline, we're going to meet that activity that we set up for ourselves. With flexibility, I've always tried to be flexible with what I set out to achieve. So if I feel that the lesson has not gone as well as it is, I haven't beat myself up. I thought, well, you know what, out of that lesson, I've learned a little bit about how not to do it, or I've learned a little bit about how not to talk to students, or perhaps something about that activity is not going to work. So the amount of completing a certain amount of work, I've tried to sort of be flexible in my time in the classroom with that, of to how much I've managed to achieve. Reading the class as well, because you don't know what well, you will know probably what they've come from, but you don't know what they've done in that lesson. There could have been a fallout going on, there could have been something you know, between students, between a teacher and student, something gone off. They could be coming to you from PE, they could be coming to you from a lesson where they've had a test and they've been sat for an hour or 50 minutes, depending on how long the lessons are before you. The weather could be dreadful. So when they come to you, again, it's all about what can you achieve given the actual set of circumstances that are in front of you. It's like, you know, in cards, well, you can only play the hand that you dealt. In the classroom, you can only deal with what you dealt is being dealt to you from the lesson before. So if that is going to impact on your teaching, you need to sort of read the class and work out how you're gonna go forward, how you're gonna actually do what you intended to do. Repetition, I've always been a big thing on making sure you need to repeat things again and again and again, and that's been that flexibility. What in the last lesson do I need to repeat this lesson? What in the last 4 weeks do I need to repeat? So I'm being pretty flexible. If I feel that, you know, my students know a particular verb and I feel that I want to repeat it in that lesson, I might not spend so much time on it. I might just say I'm not going to do that today because I think they've got that verb, they understand it, well, at least for this lesson at any rate. And also maybe consider if you're in a school where you've got groups on at the same time, say you've got 4 classes on, and that can happen, as it's happened in many schools I've taught in, you might decide to maybe teach your class a single sex if you feel that the behaviour is getting a little bit difficult across the year groups. Maybe put 2 classes together and put the boys and girls in one class and have 2 members of staff on it. You might decide to change your teachers around. I know that certainly worked in one of my schools that I was working at. We had 5 classes on at any one time, and it was becoming difficult for 2 teachers to just like get on with the classes for various reasons. And so we changed the teachers around, and it worked. It worked a treat for half a term, and then we put the teachers back with the classes. And it's just another way of seeing a solution to dealing with behaviour problems. So remaining attentive to your pupils and for them to you as well. I've always thought, well, the students are always going to ask what's in it for me, and also why should they bother to learn a language? Why should they buy into your lessons? And it's what I've done at the beginning of each time I picked up a group. I've asked them to introduce themselves to me in English, and I've asked them to give me all sorts of things, and I've listed a few things there, particularly what motivates you and how do you keep going when you're struggling. And that's a lesson in itself to talk to them about that. And I've said, when you write in this, I don't want you to put anything horrible about any of your teachers in there. I don't want you to swear or anything. And then basically through the year or through that term, I've incorporated some of those things into my lesson. So if you've got, I had a boy who was a diver. He went underwater diving with his dad. He didn't make that a big thing in school, but he told me about that in his letter. So in his little description. So I incorporated some bits and pieces in my lessons. You're not going to say, right, this is Johnny who's told me he's a diver, so I'm putting this up there. But that child in their head knows that you've thought about and read his piece of work, and that you've actually thought about what he likes, and secretly in his head is thinking, oh, I've got a little bit of something here that Miss or Sir are thinking a little bit about me. And it's just a little bit of psychological kind of like relationships building, which doesn't have to be announced to the class, but it works. I've always allowed my students to submit the work in different ways. So if they wanted to do it as a poster, or they've wanted to do it as a mind map or something, it's enabled them to sort of choose how they want to submit the work. I've always managed to, most of the time, stay up to date with what's going on. Thankfully, I've got a daughter that's allowed me to do that. And so I've been able to sort of keep up to date with the latest people in, and when I've been doing descriptions, or we're doing stuff about holidays and places where people might want to go, that's been useful in that respect. And also the music that's being played in that particular year, or those years in which you're teaching, allows you to keep up to date with music that you might play in your lesson. Like, say you play something to get them to finish their work quickly, or you play them something whilst they're working, if that's allowed in your classroom, because I know some schools might not be too happy about that. So with the issues that I've always been aware of, I've always been aware of the environment, how I use my voice, my body language, and the actual things I've said in the classroom. I've always been careful with my layout. I've always tried to think, right, do I go with horseshoe? Do I go with a seating of rows? Do I go with groups of desks? And again, you might be constrained according to the rules that your school or trust has, in which case you might have no say in that. But sometimes I've just, even in schools where I've been working where there's been a policy about having particular layout of desks, I've just said, I'm really sorry, but this is not working for this group, so I'm just going to change my classroom. And I've ended up changing it for all classes, not just for that one class, because it's just, I've known that I've been okay with most of my classes, but that class is a nightmare. And then I've gradually drip fed back onto the school's own particular policy. The lighting in your room can be quite, I've always tried to keep the lighting fairly, when I've been using my whiteboard, fairly low, because it's just enabled the students to be able to see what's on the board. The temperature is something that we often don't have a control over, particularly with COVID. We've had to keep all the windows open and things. So again, I found that the warmer the temperature, as you will know, the more difficult the students can be. So keeping it as airy as possible. Wall displays have always been important for me in my rooms. It's very rare that I've had my own classroom because I've worked in schools where I've been quite nomadic, so I've been moving around, but I've always tried to make sure that whichever classroom I'm in, I've spoken to the teacher whose classroom it is and asked if I can have a section of one of the display boards where I've been able to just put some words and regularly change the words. And I've even kept a plastic Polly Pocket in the front of my folder. I've kept some vocab in there, and I've asked one of the students, normally one of the naughty students, to put them up on the board for me at the beginning of the lesson. And it's just giving them that little bit of a job to do so that they're actually out of the seat and they feel that they've got a little bit of responsibility. If you are in a classroom where you can keep yourself in there all the time, so it's your room, keeping your board as clutter-free, your board as clean as possible after each lesson, and decluttering your classroom is difficult. I understand when you're dealing with lots of different textbooks, you've got lots of different books, but you find that students who have behaviour problems may well have a cluttered home at home, and so coming into a nice decluttered classroom puts them into a frame of mind that they might want to learn. It might not, but most of the time I've experienced that it has had that positive impact on them. I've always managed to go around the room at the end of the day, or always had a good relationship with my cleaner in the rooms the schools I've worked with, and they've always managed to get rid of all the graffiti off the desks if there has been any in a school. If that's how your students sometimes are, they do sometimes write on the desks. I think in one school I worked at, which was very challenging, I even had my own bottle of ethanol and my own bottle of quite strong cleaner that I would do after every lesson, just to get the graffiti off the desks, because it was so difficult teaching at that school that was a common feature. Having what a good one looks like, we talked about that earlier on, and having maybe some, I've worked in a couple of schools where the policy has been to have some grading on the wall, so what a level 9 looks like, what a level 7 looks like, what a level 5 looks like at GCSE, and you know what a student's work, a positive attitude's got, and good how to set out a piece of writing. In terms of that, I've done it myself where I've had a student's past exam, which I've recalled back with permission from parents, obviously, and then I've shown how not to set out an exam paper where obviously I've taken all the names off, where the students have written over the lines where on the exam papers it says do not write in this margin, because when they are scanned in, that piece of work, if it's written in the margin, will get cut off. So I've just shown, just having simple things like that to show students how to set things out gets them into good habits and shows them what a GCSE paper looks like, and it makes them realise that they're actually you know, this is serious business, this GCSE. This is not just a Mickey Mouse thing that you're going to slap a few words on a piece of paper. And then moving on to my voice, I've trying to be as relaxed, throwing your voice like an actor. It's almost like getting your voice and using it as throwing like you would a stone, as if it's coming out of your mouth, so that you're being able to sort of get to the whole classroom and speak to those at the back. There are lots of different courses out there that you can go on for voice training and so on. Sometimes I've spoken to individuals quietly behind them and just had a quiet word, because that works better than publicly humiliating them as they see it in the class. And then if you find yourself getting wound up in a lesson, we all have been in those classes where we get a dry mouth, where we start to talk a lot really quickly, we stumble over our words, we might have our voice going up really squeaky. So I've always thought, right, I'm going to need to say, I just pause, and in my head I would say 1, 2, 3, 4, got to wait a little more, and that's just giving me time to compose myself, ready for the next thing that comes out of my mouth. Often, so thinking about your body language in the presence in a classroom, does your body language signal aggression, or does it signal self-confidence? I've watched so many ECTs, what used to be called newly qualified teachers, and student teachers in lessons, and more experienced teachers who, in a lesson where they are faced with a class that are challenging, will fold their arms at the front of the lesson. And that gives the class straight away, it shows that kind of like, I'm here, leave me alone, I don't want to have anything to do with you kind of thing. And so it's kind of like thinking about how you can show that you are the boss, that you are there to mean business. I mean, we all take on the role in the classroom like an actor. So how you're standing, many lessons I've stood with my back to the door to stop them getting out and stop kids getting in. And I've taught to the lesson, I've spoken to the class, and the class I've actually taught the lesson full on for 60 minutes, and it's exhausting. But do you know what? I've never had any issues with behaviour by doing that with some of those classes. And as I say, teaching students that are challenging is very tiring, and it really does take it out of anybody who does that once a week, let alone 20 times a week. Because you've got to think, how do you look to the students? How do they perceive you? I'm always very, I gesticulate a lot when I'm teaching. I don't ever sort of stand in one place. But I found that with those kind of classes, I did stay in one place. I did feel that way I got their attention on me, because the minute they saw me walking, their eyes could sort of avert to someone else, and that's when it would start off. So that's when you would start with behaviour problems. So I was used to keep my movement very limited. And as I said, don't make a public spectacle is something that I've always found. Keeping everything positive with language, my language, and I very rarely don't ask a question. So I've always been of the mindset of don't ask a question if you don't want an answer. So I would say to them, I want you to do this. I expect you to do this, or I'm just going to remind you about my expectations. Or maybe some of you have forgotten your manners and are speaking over me, rather than saying, why aren't you working? Well, it's more, I want you to get on with your work so that we can move on, that kind of thing. Okay. So coming towards 20 to 5 now, so we'll have a look at a few techniques, some of which have gone, don't know what happened there, sorry, some of which have gone on in other sessions that we've run. But certainly I've always started with the bigger picture, and I've worked backwards. I've looked at what my end of unit activity has been, and then maybe even spoken to the students and said, right, this is what we're going to be doing next term, next half term, next 4 weeks. This is the kind of steps that we're going to need to do, and this is the kind of stuff that we're going to need to learn. And they've sometimes said, oh, Miss, can we do this? And you'd be surprised at how the students who are a bit more tricky to deal with will come up with some good ideas. And I've always taken those on board. I've not necessarily used them, but I've taken them on board, and I've thanked them for their contribution. But I've always made time for that in my teaching. And this is an example of involved a girl called Danielle. So one of my students was called Danielle. We used this piece of work, and also we would then sort of make it where we would exploit it for as much as we can, the meaning, the phonics, the grammar, and then maybe get it done as a piece of speaking or a writing. Okay. And to do that, this is an example of what we have on Language Note, where you've got maybe a text and you can exploit it with any way that you wish. So you might have your questions in the target language, in English, you might have a gap fill, you might have true or false. Those are the different ways in which, and we've got loads and loads of different other ways. It's just a sample that I'm showing you. So plenty of variety. When I teach things like clothes, I usually get a member of staff, usually the head of year, to pop in and just speak to me for 2 minutes, and then they've left the lesson, and I say, right, what was that person wearing? And they would then have to tell me in the target language what clothes that person was wearing. Again, could maybe use he was wearing such and such. I might even wear 7 or 8 different layers on myself and actually take them off in the lesson. Having said that, if a child goes home and says Miss was stripping in the lesson, you might have a different set of that might not go down very well, but at the end of the day, it's just a bit of fun. When I've done bodies as well, sticking with bodies and clothes, I've used maybe an ice hand. So I've got a plastic glove, filled it with water, stuck it in the freezer, and then I've had some peeled grapes, some nuts, a bag of baked beans, and I've gone in, and the kids who are up for it, you know, the ones who are going to be your troublemakers, will come up to the front, put the hand in a bag and say, oh, it's a hand, in c'est la main, or das ist ein Hand, or something like that. And it's just making them sort of feel as if just getting them out of their seats and doing something a little bit different. And you can always guarantee that your ones who are going to be your troublemakers will have a go at that. I've got loads of other ideas. If you wanted some ideas to give you, I can send you something out if that's what you would like. So involving my main troublemakers, I would have myself as I'm doing it. So when I'm doing choral repetition, I do, and I'd have my troublemakers at the front, usually 2 or 3 of them. So as a group, I would say je travaille, then we would say je travaille as we do for the troublemakers, and then the class would do it. And that way, I've always been able to keep an eye on my people, on the students at the front who I think might kick off during choral repetition. We've all done words with gestures. That helps too, with some students who, you know, need to have a little bit of movement when they're working. And lesson endings, as I've said, finishing a little bit early to give out house points or whatever rewards you've got, just sends them away in the right frame of mind. So, you know, right, I've put it on the system that you've got 15 points today, so you can check that with so and so if you want at the end of the day. It's just giving them that sort of glow as they leave the lesson. I've tried to keep away from giving them tests. I've always used quiz, and we use that on our site as a quiz as well, because I think if they think it's a test, I'm not doing this test. If they think it's a quiz or a challenge, or just something that's less threatening in the words that you use, they will make more of an effort. Again, they might not, but the ones in my experience, most of them have. With the different senses, I've tried to sort of bring in, you know, if we're doing things like I would like, I've tried to bring in some sort of smell things, like maybe a different few perfumes, or some senses of different smells of drinks or different teas or anything like that. Just a little bit different to get them talking, and it just taps into their different learning styles, if those things exist anymore, because they've been criticised over the last couple of years in the teaching world. Mini whiteboards is an absolute 1 hour training session on its own for me, because mini whiteboards was something I used an awful lot of. So one of the things I might do is I say, right guys, draw a circle on your board, and then I want you to tell me in French, I'm going home. So they would have to put I'm going home around the circle, and then they'd have to draw a picture in the middle of the circle, and we give points for the best sort of pictures and stuff. You set them a time limit of 30 seconds, so they've got to be quick. Or I might ask them to put the circle as part of the word. Just different things of bringing the changes. That obviously props, costumes and wigs, we've all probably used those, but they're great. Some students I've had love writing on tablecloths, so the cheap ones that you can buy. I know it's a bit of you think, oh, it's going to cost money, and it does sometimes, but a little bit of budget spent for those things can help with classes that are a bit more tricky. I had a group of boys once who didn't like to write. Excuse me, my voice is going there. I've covered some boxes I just got a load of cardboard boxes from the local shops, supermarket, covered them in paper, and they wrote on the boxes. And then I just chucked them in my stockroom, and every time we had a lesson of writing, we'd pull out the boxes. And it just helped with the writing. And that was a whole class of about 15 boys who were quite tricky. With colour coding, again, I might let them write in different colours, or I might get the nouns were certainly in one colour, the adverbs and verbs, and then blocking together maybe your genders. So when you are teaching them, get all your masculine, your neuter, your feminine together. If you teach German or any other language, masculine, feminine, it just gives them that sort of just helps them with their retention in their heads. And obviously for consistency, I'd use either the indefinite article or the definite article. I wouldn't try and mix and match the two, because you don't realise how difficult that can make it for some students whose attention spans are not particularly great. Excuse me. I might link it to jobs, so some kind of jobs that they would be doing in the future. What kind of vocabulary would we be using? And I had way back in 2007, 8 and 9, I was teaching 3 years of MBQ, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore, but it was where I had a group of of boys who were all into construction and a group of girls who were all the beauty girls, the beauticians, and I had to write a complete scheme of work to fit those kind of kids who were very basically they were not interested in learning languages, but they had to do a language. And I've got 5 years worth of lessons, 4 years worth of lessons, sorry, and I've put a couple of a bit later on, which I won't spend time talking about, but I've put them in the PowerPoint. And anybody who wants to have copies of those lessons, please email me. I am more than happy to send them out, because they took some writing and they worked so well with those with students who were not doing a language after a particular year. Sometimes I would say, right, freeze frame in the lesson, let's just freeze on whatever kind of like they were doing, whether they were writing, whether they were talking to their friend, they would have to freeze. And that way it just helped refocus on the thing, because they enjoyed doing that, and it just helped a little bit with behaviour, and it helped as well with kind of like building relationships with students, but also it helped with anybody who moved got points deducted, or anybody who didn't move got an extra house point or something like that. There's lots of things out there where, you know, you listen for a word, so you put a word up on the board. It might be a word that they might be a high frequency word that they sometimes get wrong, like Sehenswürdigkeiten in German, or sometimes like le mariage in French, or something like that. And you want to just keep revisiting that word because they forget it, like un projet, which is often used as project when in actual fact it's a plan. And I just say to them, right, if you hear me say that word in the lesson, I want you to stick your hand up. And it's amazing how many kids just are really focused on that. Secret student, I think I've mentioned this in a training session before, which is where I've first time I've had them, I've put a post-it under a chair, and at the end of the lesson I've said, right, I want you to get up and have a look under your chairs, and if you see the secret student, you've got that, you behaved well this lesson, so you can have a point and choose somebody in the class who gets some points with you. And then after that, I've gone forward with the secret student, and I've never put it again under the chair. I've hidden it somewhere in the room, or I've just chosen the student at random and written it on a board somewhere, or had it in my head, and I've said, right, secret student, you've worked really well this lesson, and as a result of it, the whole class are going to get a reward. And it's more often than not some of the more truculent students that I've chosen. When you're doing writing, spelling backwards is quite good, especially spelling in the air, because that's quite challenging. Some students quite enjoy doing that, and it's a fun thing to do, just for a few minutes with the class, and it helps with attention of some students who have behaviour problems. Managing the cognitive load of how much you actually teach them. I've always gone with 9. The research says that 20 words can be held in the head from every lesson. Whether that carries on to the next one is a different matter, but can be picked up receptively and 10 productively. We all know that's not the case, because, you know, vocabulary is so difficult. It's in one ear, comes out the other. But with the rule of 9, I've always gone with 3, 3, 3, and I've always been able to play noughts and crosses with it, or students have remembered 3 words across, down, in a diagonal line. They've always been able to sort of kind of like pick those up, and that's always been my sort of mantra, really, to try and stick to just 9 things in a lesson if possible. Speed of retrieval. So if I've done a vocab list with them, I've said to them, right, we're going to see that list of vocab again in the next 2 weeks, next 3 weeks, next 4 weeks. And I've usually given it a name, so it could be 1A, 1B. I keep a very tight handle on what I'm teaching and when I'm teaching it, and the numbers of the actual titles of it. And then I've said to them, right, I want you to, in your books at the back, I want you to put 1A. I want you to see how quickly you can retrieve these words from your book, from your memory. And they've written it down, and then they've scored in the margin the actual time. So the way they do that is, and this can be tricky if you've got no possibility of using mobile phones. So the way around that is, I've always had, for every classroom that I've been a head of department in, a set of mirrors and a set of stopwatches. And so the kids have got the stopwatches for the timing of themselves. So they've recorded the time in the margin. And then when we've next done that set of vocabulary, or I've put it up as a starter activity, and I've said to them, right, we're doing 1A, quickly, I want you to write this down. And they've put it on a whiteboard in the back of the books, and then they've started the stopwatch, and then they've they've stopped it as soon as they've gone down the list, or as many as they can retrieve, and then they've gone back to it in the book where they've recorded 1A, and they can see that maybe in week 1 they did it in 20 seconds, but in week 2 it's taken them 30, or week 7 it's taken them 30 seconds, and it's just given them that kind of ownership of how quickly they're retrieving vocabulary. The mirrors are used for phonics, so and getting the sounds right. So again, they're looking at themselves. Again, you can use that with your phone if you've got a camera reverse to do as almost if you're taking a selfie. But again, some schools don't allow phones to be out. So the way I get around it is with the stopwatches and the mirrors. Here you've got an example of a reading window, which is just basically a card with some laminate stuff stuck in the middle. And basically, to help students with reading, I've got these in different sizes, and it just allows them to focus on a certain amount of text at any one time, and they just move it down. And that's worked well with students who struggle with longer texts. And then the caramba is just a load of lollipop sticks where you write the word in target language on one side and then the English on the other. You chuck them all in a pot. Some of them have got caramba on, and they work in groups, and they pull one out, and if they get it right, because obviously they can check, they keep it and they have another go, or they move on to the next one, depends on how you want to play it. If they get it wrong, it goes back into the pot. And if they pull out caramba, every stick that they've got, they have to chuck back in the pot and start again. And that's really good for intervention or any extra revision sessions that you do. Karaoke is something that I love to do. I've got a big microphone that I use, and I take it into the classroom and the kids speak. But again, that's going to depend on whether you can afford to buy one of those machines or not. There's a lot on there. That's an example of a lesson, which I'm not going to go into because you can read that at your own leisure. So celebrating success is so important. You might have be able to get it out on Twitter. There's so much out there on Twitter now that you might have somebody in school who's actually responsible for that, and that helps with engagement as well. Parental engagement, obviously, exam help evenings with food and prize draws for attendance is really great, particularly for students who are not often coming to attend at evenings. Lesson endings I've spoken about. Step towards. So I've always been really quite picky when I give out so if I send a letter home or give a reward out or anything like that, I've always done it in the first week back after each half term or each term, because I feel if we do it on the Friday, on the Thursday before a half term or the end of a term, then yes, they go away with that fantastic glow, and then they have a week or 2 weeks off, 6 weeks off or whatever, and they come back and they've forgotten that they've had that reward, so they start again with bad behaviour. Whereas if you give it to them at the beginning of each term, you send it out the second or third day after the Monday, like this week, if you've gone back on Monday, I'd be sending them out today or tomorrow. And that way, you've got more of a chance that those kids are going to remember, actually, this lesson's not that bad, I'm getting rewards. And that will hopefully carry on for a few weeks rather than it be lost with no week of school. And I have a very rigid stepped pyramid, because if you send big rewards out early, then you've nowhere to go with it after a few weeks. And that came from working in a very challenging inner city school where I worked that out. So if you want a copy of that, just let me know. Obviously, certificates and assemblies and things like that is on there. And this is a checklist where students can just keep an eye on how they're getting on, because that links in with a formative assessment. And I'm just checking that we've got 6 minutes left. There's a couple of examples here of the sentence builders of the achievement. Shows you how they're getting on with the exam skills, the sentences, the achievement certificate from Language Nut. And then here, this is how they've done in their speaking from a school that I worked in. So going back to how you can make low stakes assessments, getting into the habit of getting the pupils to do one of the following at the end of the lesson. So while you're giving your students the rewards, they can be making a bingo card, which they're going to be using for the next lesson, or a noughts and crosses grid, or something like that, which allows you to put the rewards on the system. Again, you could just give them one of these and give them points for how many words they can make up from the language, a starter or a finisher, just so that you can do that thing at the end of the lesson and not forget that reward. I've always found, I call them martini verbs, because if you of a certain age as I am, you know, you remember the song anytime, anywhere, any place, anywhere, it's a wonderful world you can share. That's martini. And if you Google that, you'll find the videos. But you can see here, I've tried to keep the high frequency verbs, and we, you know, saying them to the ceiling, to the floor, to the door, to the window. Just different ways of doing it to make verb learning a little bit less boring, some students say. And then on Language Note, we've got all the high frequency verbs across 8 different tenses. Again, this has worked well with some students, just having those verbs written out in that and just sticking to those 6 verbs. Those 6 verbs can be used with all of the topics that you need to do for your GCSE. And the vocab crunch again, and how this works is you can test each other on that, and that's helped with some students because they've had multiple copies of that. Some have even carried it around in a blazer pocket just as a bit of something to help with revision, and it helps them at home as well, because somebody can test them in English and they can say, you know, they can say the other side and it can be checked. We've got all the high frequency vocab, we've got all the vocab for all 3 exam boards in the UK on our website if you wanted to have a test, a free trial. Again, a student might have this as what I showed you before, the bookmark. This is another variation. So this would be, make sure you include all of these in your work, or as many of these as you can. But what certainly has worked for me is making sure that they know 3 of each. So 3 colours, 3 animals, 3 body parts. Doesn't matter which ones they know, as long as they know 3 of them. Okay. And then I'm just going to whiz through some of the things we've got here. We've got different ways of using a little bit of fun with balancing butterflies and clowns, writing on t-shirts, making themselves a poster, drawing on the poster around someone and writing words in there, making lots of different things, using glasses if they're asking a question, and a hat or a wreath or a garland if they're an answerer, writing on pebbles and balloons. They might be really good at revising and learning things. So you have an Oscar in the classroom that's awarded to students for good behaviour, for example, or a good section of a lesson where they've actually managed to behave. That's worked really well. This is an example of a module of a theme of work that I mentioned earlier for students who are really tricky. And again, I can send you any of these. This is just some of the samples from the overarching screen, overview of the scheme of work rather. This is about how to practice answers and questions. So they might dress up, and halfway through the lesson you'd have you swap over. So I've often had them wearing a policeman's helmet, one student who would check on pronunciation or would make sure that they were actually asking the questions and answering them. And if they didn't, they would get put in the jail and they'd have to do a forfeit of maybe half a dozen press-ups or something a bit fun at the end of the lesson. And you'll always get students who don't want to do it, and one of the naughty ones will go, "I'll do it for you, miss," and they'll stick their hand up. So they'll be out the front doing 10 press-ups on behalf of that person. But in actual fact, that they're engaging with the lesson and you're building relationships. And then speaking and listening, you again wearing a mask for some students who don't want to talk, but actually you're not necessarily going to film them, but you might be actually recording them and get them out to the front so they don't have to look at the rest of the class. They can do it behind a mask. And again, you can see what I've done there when you get this presentation, if that's what you'd want to do. And again, the fun with writing on t-shirts. If you go to those, if you buy them, you can probably get them quite cheap, or get the kids to bring in an old shirt or something. And again, they enjoy writing on concert bands. It just gives them that vocabulary there that they can just write any words that they're not remembering on those and wear them at home or do it as homework. And that is a pretty much this is structure of the last section. So I've got a minute to go. And I'm just going to ask Fiona if she would have mind, if there are any questions in the chat, Fiona, at all.
So no questions so much on the content. A couple of people asking if they can have access to the slides, which I can say to anybody asking that, I'm sure if you drop Elaine email, you can see her email on the slide currently being shared on the screen. If you drop her an email, she'll be happy. Sorry, speaking for you, Elaine, I'm sure you're happy to share the slides from this as well. And obviously as well, if anybody's interested in using LanguageNut to help sort of with behaviour and would like to trial it, see if it's something that would work well with your students, again, just drop us a message, and we can set you up on a free 30-day trial as well.
Yeah,
but other than that, I don't think we've got any questions for now. Again, if any questions occur to you, do just drop one of us a message.
Yeah.
And Elaine, I'll leave it to you to wrap up.
Yeah, thank you. So I hope that you've picked up some tips from there. Like I said, it is a very personal session I've done tonight in terms of what has worked for me. It might not work for you, but there's all sorts of ways of tweaking things and doing things. And if you do want to get in touch, there's my email address, elaine@languagenut.com. Any of us are on there with their first name plus @languagenut.com. And Daniel works a lot with our customer support team and with our sales team, who if you are interested in getting one, especially in the run up to the year 11 and A-level exams, because I'm sure those of you that do A-level will have been in touch with Fiona if you have used LanguageNut. We have very comprehensive French and Spanish resources on there, film and literature, all the different topics, and Fiona is on it. If you feel that you wanted to have a trial or to have a look at the resources, please do email Fiona@languagenut.com. And obviously, I hope that with run up to the exams, having a trial may well put your students, give them lots of exam practice, and why not? We're offering it free, so why would you not do that? So thank you very much for attending tonight. I hope you've enjoyed the session, and have a very nice evening.
Thank you.